This is 9/11, 10 years after. From WMAL and the museum, where history lives. Here is Torie Clarke.
Joining us now is John Matthews, longtime WMAL news director. 9/11, 10 years ago, had to have been an extraordinary day for you, for WMAL. And just take us back to that day. What were you doing before it all started to happen? What was the first thing you heard and you learned?
Sure.
What happened?
Well, it was a memorable day. The lead story the day that 9/11 happened was that Michael Jordan was coming back to the NBA and coming back and joining the Washington Wizards. That was a huge story in town.
Huge Washington story.
Huge story in town. And the other big story that had been all over Washington for months was the Chandra Levy story with Congressman Gary Condit being all embroiled in all of that. And we had spent the entire summer basically following this big, huge case, and all of that got swept aside. I was doing the morning assignments at about 8:30 in the morning when I think a news flash came over the loudspeaker from ABC News basically saying something has hit the World Trade Center in New York, and I looked up on the television, and you see the World Trade Center tower smoldering.
What did you think it was? When you first saw that image, what did you think?
I assumed that it was a small plane.
Right.
The early indications we were getting on the television, and then largely that's where we were getting our information, that's what they believed as well. So we were watching it for a few minutes, and of course we broke into regular programming, and we were carrying some of the network television coverage, which is what you do in the early portions of a crisis before the radio people can get themselves up to gear. And we were going back and forth with this, breaking back into regular coverage so we could do traffic and weather and things like that, because this was still a New York story at that time. And of course it all changed the minute we all saw, as we were watching on our televisions, the second plane hit the second tower, and it was like flipping a switch. What was very interesting at WMAL was the second that happened, we kind of went into, okay, we're in a terrorism mode, and we instantly switched into our brain set was, it could happen here. We actually put a call in. I put a call into the Pentagon, and I spoke to some public affairs officer in the Pentagon and said, and basically got a few seconds of tape from him basically saying, the Pentagon's on alert, we have no reason to believe that there's any problem here in Washington, and everything is okay. And then, of course, within minutes after that, the Pentagon was hit. But as we were obviously in wall-to-wall coverage by this point.
And who was on the air that morning?
That would have been Tim Brandt and Andy Parks,
right.
WMAL's longtime morning team. And one of my first jobs was to call our afternoon host, Chris Core, and have him come in. And actually, the funny thing is, we weren't quite the 24/7 news world operation that we are today. We didn't have mobile phones that gave us news instantly. I had to call 2 or 3 people. None of the 2 or 3 people I called had heard about any of this.
And you're calling them on landlines.
Calling them on landlines, and they haven't checked in on the internet. They don't have the TV necessarily on. It's amazing. 10 years later, you wouldn't have to worry about this, because even if all you're doing is looking at your Facebook page, somebody's going to post up there instantly, World Trade Center hit. So it was really interesting how I actually had to call people and explain to them what was going on and get them into work. But our coverage continued, and eventually our morning guys got off the air. Andy Parks tried driving downtown to see what he could find out, and he didn't get more than like 6 or 8 blocks before he just hit gridlock. The other host, Tim Brandt, went down to the Naval Observatory, and that's as far as he got. So, everybody who works at the radio station, if they work in sales, if they work in production or programming or promotions, everybody went into instant work mode. We had our production director happen to be dropping somebody off at National Airport that day. So he spent the entire day at National Airport giving us live reports about people being ordered to walk out with their luggage in hand off the airport property that day. We had other people. I got my reporters out as quickly as possible. and we just kept processing stuff on the air. I'd see something happen, and I'd run in the air, open the microphone, and talk. There was no, I didn't even wait for somebody to introduce me. That's just the way it happened that day.
It's real time. Were you taking callers?
We did take some callers. We got some very good early information from people who were driving to work at the Pentagon. And as a matter of fact, they were basically confirming, and it was all coming together very quickly. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. We'd get one person who could tell us it was an American Airlines plane that hit the Pentagon. We got some other conflicting reports, but people would call in and correct them. Our former general manager, somebody who had been at the radio station for 40 years, was playing tennis across the street from the Pentagon. He called in, and we put him on the air, and he became, his name's Andy Ockershausen. He became our reporter at the Pentagon for a couple of hours before we could actually get one of our own reporters down there. He saw, and what's really interesting is it took 24 hours for the rest of the world to catch up to what we had on the air. He saw that it was an American Airlines plane. He saw that it had hit the portion of the Pentagon that had been under construction, so he correctly surmised and guessed on the air that perhaps fewer people died because it was in a section.
Man.
It was in a section that wasn't really opened yet.
Very few people realize that.
And he said, the damage may not be so bad because it was part of the building that had been fortified.
Right.
We had all of this on the air within a half an hour of the building having been struck. And, of course, we didn't realize at the time what we had. But it was just a very integral part of our coverage.
That coverage, you won the Edward R. Murrow National Award, a very prestigious award for that coverage.
Yes, we did.
What was it that you think set your coverage apart from others?
I'm not sure that it, and we've got the news resources of New York and Washington. If you're going to hit two places in America where the media is going to be, it's these two cities. We've got great resources, but I'll tell you, what I think set us apart was that we didn't have to worry. We just threw everything, we threw all programming clocks away. We didn't have to worry about hitting traffic at a certain time. We didn't have to worry about hitting the sports. All we did was just blow open the doors, and that's the great equalizer. I mean, we're getting off point a little bit, but that's the great equalizer in this business. You still only have 60 minutes an hour to fill, and we were filling it with, we just had every resource that we had was out there, and we didn't run a commercial for 4 days on this radio station.
I was just going to ask you about advertising. That's amazing.
We did not run a commercial for 4 days. Even when we ran the network newscast, the minute commercial that goes in between the front and the back half of the newscast, we were filling that with local information. So we'd go to ABC for 2 minutes, we'd fill it with local information for a minute, and we'd go back to ABC News, and we did that for 4 days, round the clock. At the time, I had an assistant news director working with me, and he and I kind of ran things on shifts for the first couple of days, and that first night, I actually went home. We lived right near each other. I went home, got clothes for the two of us, and came back to work, and we just worked it.
And you lived here.
And we lived here.
When you look back at that coverage at that time, would you do anything differently?
Would I do any? Well, it's kind of hard to put that in modern terms. In modern terms, yes, there's a lot that we've learned. There's a lot that we learned that day. We didn't have good enough communications in terms of being able to speak to our people out in the field because every cell phone tower was jammed, obviously, and we were even at the point on the air where I was making appeals to my reporters out in the field. If you can hear my voice, get to a landline.
Wow.
Get to a landline and call in. And I made that appeal a couple of times on the air because my reporters were not able to get through. So if I had it to do over again, we would fix some of the communication shortfalls that we had, and actually all of the radio and TV stations in town did that after the fact. But in terms of the coverage that we provided, I wouldn't change a thing. Mm-hmm. I've said this before. As terrible and as tragic as that day was, it was not just for WMAL, but I think for the American news industry as a whole. I think it was one of our greatest days.
Mm-hmm.
Because
really stepping up to the plate.
Everyone stepped up to the plate. Uh-huh. And when you listen back to some of the coverage from that day, and just hearing people who normally on television have their guards up, and you see the shiny veneer of them in normal everyday world, seeing everybody with their guard down. Having one of my one of the memories that sticks out most to me is Peter Jennings, the consummate ABC newsman, revered in the halls of ABC News, trying to absorb that the first tower had fallen.
Right.
It had not entered his mind, and there was a reporter somewhere in Midtown Manhattan describing the building collapsing, and Peter Jennings just kind of going, the building collapsed? The entire building collapsed? And you can hear in his voice that he can't even process this.
Right.
And if he can't process this, imagine what it's like for everyone else in America trying to absorb, and we all absorbed it together.
I heard a reporter talk about that once, and he said, and it was a fellow who's done a lot of anchoring, and he says, usually even if it's a crisis, you know what the crisis is. You've been told there's a hurricane that's about to hit Florida, and so you know what it is you're about to see, what you're about to talk about. He says in this case, you just had to receive it as it was happening. You had no time to be prepared mentally or emotionally for what was happening.
Yeah.
And so you did see a lot of these journalists in a very, very real fashion. So you refer to this as, those were sort of the old days. How dramatically do you think news coverage changed as a result of 9/11? How has it changed since? What did you do differently after 9/11? After
9/11, everything was seen through a different prism. Everything was seen through a different point of view. There was a lot more, I don't know if cynicism is the right word, but everything that happened, you kind of instantly thought, is this terror related?
Right.
I remember we had that crash in New York about a month after 9/11, and the general assumption immediately was, and rightfully so, was that it was a terror-related crash. But I think that has kind of, with everything, has kind of the first question becomes, how is Al-Qaeda somehow involved in this? So I think that has changed. I think we went through a period where things got a lot better in terms of coverage. I think we went through a period in America where people set aside their distrust of the media for a while and gave us the benefit of the doubt. Without putting the political prism, without adding that to the equation. I think that there was a period of time when everything got a little more, the institution of the media received more trust than it had for some time. I think obviously that collapsed in fairly short order. In terms of how the media does its job, I think more systems have been put in place to ensure that coverage can be made, but I think technology has kind of, even Twitter, this isn't a discussion of that, but I think technology has changed the way that we cover things. I think that as happens, everything heats up to a point where things get much better and more resources are added. And I think that once that initial rush wears off, there's a lot of recession. You recede away from that. I think that the media was built up for a period of time. On the day that 9/11 happened, there was hardly an FM radio station in this country that had any news coverage whatsoever. So they were all left to turn over to the TV stations and just run TV audio. Our sister FM stations here in this building put on WMAL. Right. And then a lot of them went and got some emergency coverage and backup. But over time, you've seen all of that kind of recede and go away again. If we had another, I've said before, there's been a lot of resources that have been cut out of the news media, and I think the only way you're ever going to get some of those resources to come back is to have another 9/11.
Right. But you make the point about technology. I think that's a really, really interesting one. 9/11, 10 years ago, cell phones barely worked, often didn't work.
Yeah.
How have all these new things, Twitter, Facebook, etc., 24/7 doesn't begin to describe the instantaneous nature of coverage and news coverage. How has it impacted both the quantity is pretty obvious, but the quality of the work that you all can do?
Well, I think it has really erased the lines of what constitutes a reporter and what doesn't. If you think 10 years ago, we didn't even really have bloggers.
Right.
Today, bloggers are every bit as much reporters or thought of as reporters are. So it has really blurred the lines as to what is news and what isn't news. I think what really kind of can make that distinction again is having a situation where and this is going to sound cynical, but it's from someone who's actually felt the brunt of the changes in media.
Yeah.
What it's going to take is a situation where money has to be spent, and if money has to be spent, that's what separates the professionals from the amateurs in all of this. And the other story that comes to mind over the past decade that was huge in that way was Hurricane Katrina, where you had all of the major news organizations, spending oodles and oodles and oodles of money to get their people to New Orleans and to the Gulf Coast that Joe Average can't do quite so much. You might get Joe Average's Twitter feed from what he can see outside his door in Biloxi, Mississippi, but you're not going to get that kind of a coverage. So,
and you may not get the context.
And you won't get the coverage or the context. I think that there's been, I think there's been an erosion in the quality of news. Certainly, all you need to do is look at the Washington Post and see that it's a shadow of its former self, and that's not necessarily the Post's fault. The technology has killed newspapers as much as anything else.
Right.
So the technology end of it is the good news is that everyone can weigh in. The bad news is that everyone can weigh in.
Yeah. So you're an observer of this town as well, of Washington. How do you think it's changed since 9/11? How's the town changed?
That's a big question to ask, because I think the town's changed in a lot of ways, but not necessarily all due to, certainly not all due to 9/11. I think, I think the political divisiveness in this country is what is changing this town more than anything else. And to the to the point that you can put any of that on September 11th, I don't think you really can. In terms of how September 11th has changed this town, I mean, from my point of view, it's the things that you can see. It's the much greater security. It's the fact that you can't drive in front of the White House anymore. We used to be able to do that. They're searching bags on Metro, and certain civil liberties that we've given up over the years that we never even really thought about before.
Should we have given them up?
You know what? I'm a news guy.
Yeah, right.
I'm a news guy on a news talk station. I'll let the talk guys deal with that.
Gotcha.
Deal with that question.
Yeah, I can say it. I think we've gone too far in the name of protecting physical structures. Mm-hmm. I think we've gone too far. So you personally, how have you changed? And as a result of 9/11, if you have changed as a result of 9/11?
I don't think people think of themselves in that in those terms. I benefited professionally quite a bit from what happened on September 11th, and it's not something I'm proud of, but it's just something that happened. I mean, I'm certainly not the first person, and certainly not even the best example of how news events give people their chances, their breaks. And in that sense, it didn't really change things, because I had the same job afterwards as I had beforehand. Right. As long as we're rolling audio and I can think about this for a second.
Yeah. No,
I think that's one. If I can say, I think that's one of those big questions that's really just not. It works for some people and doesn't work for others. I'm not sure that it's changed me a whole heck of a lot.
I think, especially in this town, and then obviously in New York, and to a certain extent Shanksville, people who are right in the middle of it. In this town, whether it was news media covering it, or people working at the Pentagon, or people in law enforcement, say some people could really handle it. They could really handle it, and they could really step up to the challenges, and they could perform, and others couldn't. And no knocks on them. It's just different personalities react well in different situations. And I know a fair number of people in professional circles who made changes after 9/11 as a result of it, saying, okay, I really want to do this because of that, or I really want to do that because I know I'm better suited for that. We all know the stories of young people who joined the military or went into law enforcement as a result of it. But I do know people who made real changes, or sort of mid-career people who made changes based on how they felt they reacted to it that day.
If I could say one thing, and this is going to sound completely self-serving.
That's okay.
And if it makes the cut, it makes the cut. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. So having said that, if I could say one thing that it did for me professionally, is it kind of gave a wake-up call to WMAL as a news organization that we could play in that arena, that we could do news, and that we could provide a public service. Because certainly on September 11th and in the days following, people needed to know that when they woke up in the morning, they weren't going to see a bright flashing light and have it be all over. And
right.
we really did a job that day and in the aftermath, making people feel okay and at least letting them know that they could get out of bed.
Mm-hmm.
And it played it, and that helped me professionally. It helped this radio station, because a year later we were in almost to the same week. We were in the same situation with the DC snipers,
right?
And we were able. I think that 9/11 gave us the confidence to go forward, and the backing of our listening audience to go forward and break into coverage as much as we needed. And really, 9/11 itself was one day. The sniper situation was a month.
Right.
Where we were going on every day and helping the people who were afraid to buy gasoline because they didn't know if they were going to be shot, and giving them the latest news and information. And we had dozens of breaking news stories
mm-hmm.
about the sniper situation over the course of a month. And 9/11 really helped us with the DC sniper stories, and to cover lots of other stories
mm-hmm.
after that.
It gave you license to do things in a certain way that others might not have been able to do.
It did, and it really provided an intimacy with the audience that we frankly no longer have, and that we
mm-hmm.
hadn't had for a long time prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
So it was special for us.
In this world in which literally tens of thousands of your listeners feel as though they're little broadcasters themselves via Twitter or via Facebook or whatever, can you regain that kind of position, that kind of influence with your listeners?
I think that that's possible. I think that's why I'm still here 29 years after I started. Mm-hmm. I think that these are decisions that in this world more and more are decided at the corporate level.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly we have people within this building and within this business that essentially that's all we want to do. And the wonderful thing about talk radio in so many places, including here, is that people can build that trust with their audience. You know, the day that 9/11 happened, we had talk radio hosts, and it really doesn't even matter who they are, but they were people who had relationships with their listeners, people who had already built that trust with their listeners, mm-hmm. and I think that afforded us a special relationship with them that really provided a service that many other places couldn't do.
Right. Anything else? Anything else we ought to be focused on? Or you think people ought to be thinking about on this anniversary?
The one other thing that had popped into my head, knowing that we were going into this conversation, mm-hmm. is, and I don't know if it's the same here in Washington and New York as it is in the rest of the country, but I really feel that there has been, and it's even in the national mood, within the national mood, and the political divide that we have, I really think people have forgotten lessons that we learned after 9/11. I think it was genuine. People cared more about each other after this great tragedy mm-hmm. happened. And people were nicer to each other. And people put American flags on their cars and actually meant a true sense of it. It wasn't just a shtick or a gimmick or the popular thing to do. People felt something that they haven't felt in a long, long time. And, you know, the same people who would like to, you know, you see people on Facebook who will say Republicans suck or Democrats suck or John Boehner is an ass or President Obama is a communist. These are the same people who 10 years ago weren't talking about these things. They were talking about, is your family okay and are you okay? Mm-hmm. And I think it would be a great time, and maybe I'm a little idealistic in this regard, but I think it would be a great time on the 10th anniversary of this great tragedy to remember how much better we were as people then than we've managed to become, at least in terms of the public discord.
Great thoughts. Great thoughts. John Matthews, terrific.
Thank you.
Just an absolute institution in this town. Thanks for sharing this with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.
This is 9/11, 10 years after. From WMAL.